It was pretty plain what these guys were up to. It was obviously two madcap Halloween revelers. One of them dressed like a gorilla, and the other very humorously put together like one of those pumpkin-headed people who look like well-fed scarecrows. They were walking down the sidewalk on Main Street, right in front of Ryan's Heating and Plumbing, when Police Lieutenant Starbuck nabbed them. Stepping from a dark doorway with his flashlight in his left hand and a pair of handcuffs clenched in his right, the gorilla started making ridiculous hissing sounds. And he opened his mouth to show his red jaws and dripping fangs. The pumpkin man appeared more faint at heart, and he collapsed in a heap right at Lieutenant Starbuck's feet. The lieutenant felt almost sorry for at least this more fragile of the two marauders, but he knew what he had to do. "Come on," the policeman said. "You're wanted for questioning." "In connection with what?" drawled the gorilla, who really was magnificent. Something in his voice indicated that indeed he had been through this kind of dialogue before. Well, a good cop doesn't have time for much nonsense. You don't have conversations with suspects before they've even been dressed down at headquarters. Starbuck hastened them to walk in a sprightly fashion right over to City Hall, which was in sight of this quick capture. After the pumpkin man, that is, had picked himself up and screwed his head back on, the gorilla was marching forward with his hands in the air and muttering in mocking tones some inane protest. In the police department office, Sergeant Baldax was sitting with his feet up on the desk, talking on the telephone. The appearance of Starbuck with a couple revelers was the least of his problems, he thought. The lieutenant heard the sergeant talking in that raspy, phone-weary sergeant's voice of his. "Damn it," he was saying, "I've got enough to put up with without you creating a holy hell of a fire tonight." Then he held up his huge mitt of a hand in a threatening sort of hello to the entering lieutenant, hardly acknowledging the two ridiculous figures who came with him. Sergeant Baldax, so it seemed to himself, was the only person in the city who was sufficiently aware what a foolish mistake it was for the fire department to be engaged in burning down an old abandoned house. In one of the fire department's famous real-life practice drills, and on Halloween Eve. It wasn't that Baldax took seriously the people who said the old house was haunted. He didn't believe in ghosts, or even pumpkins, for that matter. Good cop, of necessity not believing in much except what's right in front of him. But a little more than ordinarily difficult when right in front of him at the moment were a pumpkin man and a very lifelike gorilla. But he was proceeding in the phone conversation well enough, laying down his argument directly to Assistant Fire Chief Red O'Leary. This is the stupidest piece of business I've ever seen, he was saying to O'Leary. To be running a practice firefighting exercise right like at midnight on the most hazardous night of the year. Anything could happen. The haunted house was located down at the edge of a long, undeveloped valley north of Main Street. And the former owner, Lyman McFadden, a fashion photographer who left Virgins for California in 1983, had written a letter to the city requesting that they take over the property and tear it down, so he wouldn't be plagued by the thought of an accident or an insurance suit. Indeed, McFadden's house was the most wrecked up, miserable-looking mansion left of the old days. Huge mushrooms were growing up through cracks in the floors of the dining room, exposed thoroughly to the weather by the event of an oak tree having shouldered one winter the whole northern wall halfway off its foundation. Of course, all kinds of nocturnal creatures, like owls and bats and squirrels and runaway kittens were fighting for space upstairs. In those cozy corners where the moonlight shone on old mattresses. Where Mr. McFadden used to sleep his many visitors. But it was an opportunity for the fire department. The request having come in early October, they had spiritedly scheduled a torching of the place, then a practice drill to put it out for midnight on Halloween. Well, so, and with these two idiot revelers now standing in his office, whom the usually dexterous Lieutenant Starbuck had not yet managed to convince to take off their costumes, Sergeant Baldax was trying to call the conflagration off. "Damn it," he said again. "I've got enough to put up with." He slammed the phone down. He was really amazed that he hadn't broken that phone yet. Now, who do we have here? he said, switching to a tone of softly malicious interrogation. Now, who do we have here? Lieutenant Starbuck was meanwhile staring at the Pumpkin Man's left arm and hand, which seemed to be dangling quite loosely from his shoulder. It seemed hard to believe, but the guy must have very short arms, because he rigged up a really lifelike scarecrow effect by a pair of workman's gloves stuffed with hay that were tied to his sweatshirt so tight at the wrist with a piece of twine that the resulting Pumpkin Man didn't have any wrists at all. Starbuck decided to grab the fellow by the elbow, just to show him he knew there was flesh and blood behind that costume. But the Pumpkin Man promptly collapsed in a heap on the floor again. His pumpkin head rolled off, and Starbuck found himself going after it. He looked pretty bad, particularly since he'd handcuffed the Pumpkin Man. But things returned at least to where they had been a moment before, when the gorilla managed to swoop up the pumpkin and put it back in place on top of the sweatshirt stuffed with straw, and with the carved face staring straight at the sergeant at his desk, as it had been. Lieutenant Starbuck was kind of choked up for some reason, and the sergeant was still waiting for some explanation. Sergeant Baldax didn't believe in ghosts or creatures whose one night in the world is on Halloween, but he did believe that some people would go to extravagant lengths to amuse themselves by torturing a sensible man's understanding of reality. Pretty good, Sergeant said. You say this fellow is giving you trouble? The lieutenant said he had discovered the gorilla and his more unassuming partner strolling boldly down the sidewalk, and he'd hauled them in for questioning. Otherwise, he said, the streets were clear. New Halloween ordinances seemed to be generally working. This year, there were supervised parties in 3 different locations. At the Eagles Club, in the basement of the Congregational Church, and at the Grange Hall. A special squadron from the county sheriff's office posing as trick-or-treaters, had confiscated some 5 garbage bags full of candy from houses on the back streets. They went inside one house where an elderly couple had put on quite a nice display of old-fashioned apple bobbing, which they left alone. For the rest, the candy was right now being sorted out and tested in Middlebury for statistical results. Then it would be melted down and thrown in the sewage treatment plant. Neither Lieutenant Starbuck nor his sergeant, apparently, had noticed it immediately. But the gorilla, who moved like a dancer despite his hairy bulk, had drifted over to the file cabinet and was right then thumbing through a series of folders. The truth was that Sergeant Baldax only knew how to deal with bold criminal actions in theory. Say now, gorilla, he said in a teasing voice, as if at any moment he could drop him through the floor with a secret switch. Say now, gorilla, that's not the place for you to be looking. The sergeant then walked over and tried to lift the gorilla mask right off the reveler's head. Starbuck was trying to undo the handcuffs on the pumpkin man without having the wordless fellow crumple up on him again. The hard part was looking at his face, because you could see right through the row of teeth, the triangular nose, and the eyes to the glow of candlelight that filled the inside of his head. gorilla, meanwhile, didn't exactly enjoy being boxed on the ears. So he poked the sergeant in the stomach with his fat paw, and then arrogantly sat down himself at the sergeant's desk and picked up the telephone. How do you talk into one of these things? The gorilla asked. I'd like to talk to that fireman. O'Leary, I believe you called him. Who you were talking to before. I think they should burn the house down. What is the meaning of this? The sergeant shouted. Great, he thought. I'm shouting at a gorilla sitting at my desk. Nothing to concern yourself about, the gorilla said calmly back. Just the upper, or rather, outermost regions of hell have broken loose. We're harmless, only we're easily offended. It was hard to listen to a speech from a gorilla. Baldax found himself hoping the Pumpkin Man would say something. This is absurd, the sergeant weakly cried. But he felt like he was caving in. He kept hoping he would have the feeling he was dreaming. But the familiar, dull reality of the police department office was cold water on that hope. If this show wasn't contrived just for his benefit, it was bound to lead to something for which he wasn't quite prepared. And the gorilla kept talking. The annoying thing about you people is your superior attitude, he said. We are sick to death of your ignoring everything in the universe that doesn't happen to fit in with your definitions. Oh, a real intellectual, the sergeant shouted back at the beast. We listen to a lot of that stuff in here. Why don't you just be a good gorilla and get out of my chair? The sergeant was saying that, but he was thinking about something else. It was something in the gorilla's voice. Suddenly, he got it. The gorilla's voice wasn't coming out of the gorilla's mouth. "You're giving me a headache," the sergeant said. Then the worst thing of all happened. The gorilla seemed to open his mouth like he was going to scream or roar. And the sergeant fainted away on the floor. Starbuck, across the office, was still transfixed by the Pumpkin Man. When he heard the crash of the fallen sergeant, he moved over to help him. But the gorilla leapt over the desk and blocked his path. Okay, Baldax was behind the desk, slumped on the floor. His feet were sticking out. Wait a minute. Those weren't his feet, but just an old pair of shoes. Very calmly, and in a manner quite like the police sergeant himself, the gorilla started to dial the phone, while keeping his eyes right on the shaky lieutenant. Starbuck heard him say to the fire chief on the other end, "Okay, you can go ahead. Have your drill." "It's only a drill. We've had a change of heart around here. After all, Red old boy, it's Halloween." Now, Starbuck was slow on some things. But when he heard the gorilla talking, he knew he'd heard that voice before. And sure enough, if that wasn't the sergeant's voice. Just to make sure, he checked behind the desk. And sure enough, the sergeant was gone. So the lieutenant became extremely thoughtful. And then he surprised himself with quick action. He hadn't thought he knew what to do. But suddenly he walked right over to the Pumpkin Man and socked him in the stomach. And then he proceeded to take his clothes, his gloves, and finally he took the pumpkin itself and put it on his own head. "Let's go," he said to his partner. "We're on the other side all year. Let's see what it's like to have a real Halloween." Thus transformed, The fabulous duo went out into the night. Out toward the practice fire at the haunted house. Out among the other tricksters. Feeling privileged and lucky that the ghosts of their real selves, that the ghosts of their real selves had come to fetch them on the night, which of all nights they didn't want to be policemen.